In 2015, two young sisters vanished while stargazing from a hilltop park, leaving behind only a flashlight and a thermos. For 10 years, their case remained a chilling mystery until a college student peers through the same public telescope and sees a strange reflection in the trees. What follows is a gripping unraveling of hidden trails, forgotten shelters, and a truth buried deep in the forest, as a determined sister, a haunted detective, and an unlikely witness work to uncover what really happened that night and who never left the woods. The air was still warm when they hiked up the hill, a soft August breeze brushing against the trees as the sun gave way to dusk. Lena Marlowe walked a few steps ahead of her younger sister, Gracie, their father trailing behind with a thermos and folding chair slung over his shoulder. The trail to Telescope Hill wasn't long, but it was steep in parts, and the girls loved the challenge. Every year they came to this spot to watch the Perseid meteor shower, but this night in 2015 felt different. The sky had cleared perfectly. The stars were already beginning to prick through the navy canvas overhead, and the air was buzzing with a quiet kind of magic. They reached the summit just before 9. A flat platform stood at the edge of the overlook, weathered boards beneath their sneakers, and the old public telescope perched like a sentinel pointing skyward. Lena dropped her backpack beside the railing and helped Gracie lay out the blanket. She was 14, and already she moved with a kind of protective instinct. Gracie, only 11, was the curious one. Always asking questions, always scanning the sky for constellations she couldn't quite name. Their father, Eric, handed them hot cocoa from the thermos, his voice low and patient as he pointed out the first few meteors streaking past the horizon. They laughed and leaned into each other, the kind of laugh only sisters share. Gracie squinted through the telescope. "I think I saw Saturn," she whispered, her breath fogging the lens. Lena rolled her eyes, but smiled. By midnight, the sky had deepened to pitch, and the world around them had gone quiet. Other families who had come earlier had long since packed up. Only the Marlowes remained on the hill. Then, something shifted. Eric turned to answer a phone call just a few steps down the trail where the signal was better. He was gone for no more than 6 minutes. When he returned, the blanket was empty. The flashlight lay on its side. The thermos, half full, was resting where Gracie had left it. The telescope still pointed toward the stars, but Lena and Gracie were nowhere to be seen, and they would not be seen again for 10 years. The search began before sunrise. By 3 a.m., park rangers were combing the trails with flashlights and dogs, their calls for the girls echoing into the dark. Eric Marlowe was frantic, his voice cracking each time he called their names. He kept saying the same thing to anyone who would listen. "I just stepped away. I just stepped away for a minute." But the hilltop was empty. There were no screams, no sounds of running, no snapped branches or signs of struggle, just that quiet blanket still laid out, the flashlight flickering weakly against the wooden deck, and the telescope silently watching the dark. By morning, the county sheriff's office took over. Helicopters swept the forest. Thermal imaging drones scanned the hillsides. Volunteer groups from neighboring towns flooded in with water bottles and first aid kits, ready to bushwhack through miles of undergrowth. But there was nothing. No shoe prints, no dropped phone, not even a candy wrapper. The girls had simply vanished. News spread quickly. Local headlines called it the Stargazer disappearance. The national media showed up within days. Photographs of Lena and Gracie were everywhere, missing posters stapled to telephone poles, pinned to corkboards inside gas stations, printed onto the backs of milk cartons. Lena, with her straight brown hair and quiet smile. Gracie, in her soccer uniform, missing a front tooth, but the leads, when they came, were flimsy. A camper said he heard footsteps in the woods around midnight, but couldn't say from where. A teenager claimed to have seen someone moving near the creek bed, but offered no detail. None of it led anywhere. Weeks passed, then months. Eric Marlowe was questioned over and over. His alibi was thin, just his word, a phone call to his mother that cell tower logs only partially confirmed. Some whispered he had staged it. Others thought the girls had simply run off. But no one could explain how two children disappeared from a hilltop with only one exit trail and no sign of being followed. By the end of the year, the trail had gone cold. The platform was locked up. The telescope stood unused, chained and rusted. Maple Rock moved on. But the hill never quite did, and neither did the silence it kept. 10 years is a long time for a small town to carry a question it cannot answer. In Maple Rock, the memory of the Marlowe sisters faded at the edges, softened by distance, but never truly disappeared. Each August, on the anniversary of their vanishing, people still gathered at the base of Telescope Hill with candles and silence. Some came out of duty, others out of guilt, and a few because they had never stopped wondering what really happened that night. The observatory platform had reopened briefly in 2020 after years of being cordoned off. A new public telescope had been installed, shiny and silver, bolted in place, and angled forever skyward. Most evenings it sat untouched. The hill had gained a reputation not haunted exactly, but heavy. Visitors didn't linger there anymore. Parents no longer let their children camp near it. The park installed new lighting along the trail, and a ranger was assigned to patrol the area every night in August. But even with these changes, the hill remained quiet. Still, in 2025, the forest was thicker. The trees had grown taller. The path had changed slightly with erosion, and moss crept over the steps near the platform. But the shape of the place remained the same. The telescope stood just where it always had, watching, waiting. That August, a college student named Avery Callahan returned to Maple Rock with her younger brother in tow. She had grown up 2 counties over and remembered the story from her childhood, the missing girls who vanished into the dark. She didn't come looking for answers. She came for the sky. Avery was studying astronomy and had heard from a classmate that the hill's elevation made it a perfect spot for meteor watching. On a warm night just after the Perseids began, she and her brother hiked to the top with sandwiches, sleeping bags, and the kind of quiet excitement that comes with stars. They laughed, ate, pointed out constellations. But when Avery leaned into the telescope just after midnight, her breath caught. It wasn't the stars that startled her. It was what she saw in the reflection inside the lens, 2 faint shapes standing just beyond the trees, frozen, watching back. Avery blinked and pulled away from the telescope. The night around her felt suddenly colder, the warmth of summer fading into a thin chill. She turned to look behind her, toward the edge of the platform and the tree line beyond. There was nothing, just the dark wall of pine and the quiet hum of crickets. Her younger brother, Owen, was lying on the blanket, eyes closed, earbuds in, oblivious. She stepped back toward the telescope, hesitated, then leaned in again. This time she focused not on the stars, but on the inside of the lens, the slight, curved reflection it gave of what was behind her. And there they were again, 2 faint, blurry silhouettes, motionless. Too far back to see detail, but close enough that she should have been able to see them with her eyes alone. She turned again. Nothing. Avery adjusted the scope, angling it just slightly, trying to recreate the effect. She moved it back, just a few degrees, back to where it had been when she first looked. There. The shapes returned. She stood up straight and shook her head. Her mind raced for an explanation. Glare? Condensation? Some trick of the light or alignment of the lens? She looked up at the sky again. Crystal clear, no clouds. No source for reflections. Her heart pounded as she scanned the dark beyond the platform. She didn't want to scare Owen, but every part of her was on alert now. She reached for her phone and used the flashlight to sweep the trees. The beam landed on undergrowth, moss, and silence. Still, she couldn't shake what she saw. 2 figures, the size of children, standing at the edge of the trees like they had been waiting. Avery packed up quickly, nudging Owen awake. "We're going," she said softly, firmly. He groaned, confused, but followed without argument. As they descended the trail, she kept glancing back at the hilltop, half expecting to see someone or something step into view. She didn't tell Owen what she saw. Not yet. But she knew one thing for certain as they reached the parking lot and drove away. Whatever had happened on that hill 10 years ago had not stayed buried. Something had been left behind, and tonight it had looked back. The next morning, Avery couldn't shake the image. It followed her like an aftertaste, subtle but persistent. The reflection had been too defined, too human, to be dismissed as a trick of light. She had barely slept, her mind running loops between logic and something far less comfortable. Maybe she had seen shadows. Maybe it was just fatigue. But deep down, she knew better. She drove back to the park around noon, alone this time, under the excuse of needing fresh air. The ranger at the trailhead was seated in a small office kiosk, flipping through paperwork. Avery leaned in and asked about the telescope, who maintained it when it was last cleaned, and whether it had ever had issues with glare or reflections. The ranger, a woman named Shanna, looked up curiously. "No, not that I've heard. It's fixed in place. Pretty solid gear. Gets checked a couple times a season." She paused. "Why, did you see something?" Avery hesitated. "Just, maybe, something strange. 2 figures in the reflection, like people, but they weren't there when I looked back." Shanna stiffened, then gave a small shake of her head. "That hill's got a reputation, ever since those girls went missing." She didn't say their names, but she didn't have to. "I remember the story," Avery said quietly. "Then you know the kind of things people say. Ghosts, spirits, time loops." Shanna gave a small chuckle, but her eyes were serious. "Most of us just figure it was a terrible night, that their father wasn't watching close enough. But the truth is, nobody ever found a single piece of them, not even a shoelace." Avery nodded. "Has anyone ever tried using the telescope to look at the woods instead of the sky?" Shanna looked puzzled. "It's bolted to face north-northeast, toward the open sky. You can adjust focus, but not direction." "But what if someone did manage to shift it?" Avery asked. "I guess if someone brought tools, sure, but why would they?" Avery didn't answer. She just thanked her and hiked back up to the platform, this time in daylight. The telescope hadn't moved. But she noticed something she missed the night before, a faint scrape in the wooden deck, like metal had been dragged and realigned. Something or someone had pointed it toward the trees on purpose. Detective Mara Sloan hadn't been back to Maple Rock in almost 7 years. She thought she had buried the case deep enough that it would never claw its way back. But when her phone rang and she heard the words telescope, reflection, and 2 figures, something in her chest tightened. The voice belonged to Captain Elkins, still with the county department, still watching over unsolved cases like open wounds. He told her about the college girl, the sighting, and the strange scrape marks on the platform. He didn't say it outright, but Mara could hear it in his voice. He wanted her to come back. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she went to her garage, opened a long-forgotten metal file box, and pulled out the thick folder labeled Marlowe. The photos were still inside. The grainy image of the platform lit by flashlight, the untouched thermos, the telescope gleaming beneath the stars. She remembered standing there at dawn, watching the mist rise off the trees, knowing they were already too late. What haunted her most wasn't the lack of evidence, it was the eerie perfection of the scene, as if the girls had been lifted out of it by invisible hands. Mara arrived in town by evening. She stopped at the station only briefly to check in with Elkins, who looked older and grayer, but no less sharp. Then she drove herself up the winding park road. The hill was quiet when she reached it, the platform bathed in amber light from the new trail lamps. She walked slowly across the wood planks, tracing her steps from a decade earlier. Her boots stopped near the scrape mark Avery had described. Kneeling down, she ran her fingers across the groove, fresh, shallow, unmistakably deliberate. She looked up at the telescope and followed its line of sight, not to the sky, but to the tree line, the same direction the girls would have been facing when they disappeared. Mara stood still for a long moment, letting the night settle around her. The air held a breathless stillness, as if the forest was listening. She had come back expecting ghosts. But something else was here, watching, waiting. The next morning, Mara met Avery Callahan at the ranger station. The girl looked younger than Mara expected, barely 20, with a nervous energy that made her fidget with the strap of her backpack as they sat in the shaded outdoor picnic area. Mara watched her closely as Avery recounted the night she saw the reflection, her words careful but steady. They were just there, like standing in the trees behind me. But when I turned around, nothing. Then I looked again, and they were still in the scope. "You're sure it wasn't some kind of internal reflection?" Mara asked. "I've been studying telescopes for 2 years," Avery said, "and I've spent enough nights in the field to know when something's off. This wasn't an optical illusion. I wasn't even looking at the sky when I saw them. I was just checking the angle of the scope, and there they were." Mara nodded slowly. "And then you noticed the scuff marks?" "Yeah. When I came back during the day, I didn't touch anything, I swear. But it looked like someone had dragged the telescope just a little, like maybe to line it up with something else." Mara opened the case file she'd brought and slid a photograph across the table. A grainy image from the original investigation. Avery leaned in. "That's the same telescope?" she asked. "No. The old one was removed after the case went cold. But look at the angle. It's subtle, but the original was also turned slightly, not quite at the sky." Avery frowned. "So someone else had already pointed it away from the stars?" "Maybe. Or maybe that's where it was meant to look all along." Mara's mind turned over the facts. 2 missing girls, no evidence of flight or force. And now, a second sighting that seemed to mirror the first. She had dismissed the stranger theories back then, ghosts, alternate dimensions, abductions. But the facts had never made sense. The girls had simply disappeared in silence. Now, 10 years later, someone had seen something. And for the first time in a decade, the case didn't feel cold anymore. It felt like it was waiting to be solved. Mara returned to the platform that evening with a notebook tucked under her arm and a thermos of coffee in hand. The sun was low, bleeding orange light through the trees as shadows stretched long across the clearing. She walked slowly around the telescope, studying its bolts, the scrape marks again, and the faint path of disturbance in the wood grain, almost like someone had nudged it more than once. The scope itself was in good condition, clean, with no signs of tampering. She crouched and sighted down the barrel, squinting against the last of the daylight. The trees it pointed toward were thick, maybe 30 yards out, with a dense curtain of pine and cedar. Not an obvious trail, but something about the line of sight held her. It wasn't random. It felt chosen. She clicked on her flashlight and began moving toward the edge of the platform, stepping carefully down into the brush. Branches pulled at her sleeves. The ground dipped slightly and then rose again. As she pushed farther, her light caught on something metallic, half buried in leaves. She knelt and brushed it off. A rusted thermos cap. Her breath caught. It was old, maybe 10 years. The logo faded but still faintly legible. Wild Rock Outfitters, the same brand Lena Marlowe had mentioned back in 2015. The thermos he had packed cocoa in that night had never been recovered, only the lidless base sitting on the blanket. No one had thought to search beyond the immediate platform perimeter. Mara looked around. The trees swallowed her flashlight beam, but just ahead there was a slight clearing, like something had once stood there. She made a note of the coordinates, marked a tree with orange flagging tape from her bag, and began to retreat. Back at the platform, she sat down on the edge, heart still thudding. 10 years, and now suddenly a reflection, a scrape, a thermos cap. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was something. She turned her gaze toward the telescope again. Maybe the truth hadn't vanished with the girls. Maybe it had just shifted a few degrees to the left, hidden, not gone, waiting to be seen. Mara didn't sleep that night. Instead, she spread the case files across the desk in her motel room, each photograph and interview transcript more familiar than she wanted to admit. The original investigation had been exhaustive teams of search dogs, aerial sweeps, interviews with everyone who had been in the park that week. But for all the effort, the results had been hollow. No trace of Lena or Gracie beyond the blanket and the flashlight. No forced entry, no witnesses. She found herself returning to a page she had barely glanced at during the original case. A transcript from a short interview with a former park ranger named Carl Pruitt. At the time, his account had seemed unremarkable. He had been off duty that night, said he didn't see or hear anything unusual, just remembered the girls arriving around sunset and being polite. But now, one line stood out. They were looking through the telescope when I passed by. One of them pointed to the woods and said something like, "There's a man." I didn't see anyone. Figured she was just being dramatic. Mara sat back in her chair. No one had ever followed up on that detail, not seriously. It was chalked up to the overactive imagination of a child under the stars. She called Captain Elkins before sunrise. He answered groggily, but when she read him the line, he was silent for a long beat. Then he said, "Pruitt's still alive. Moved to a retirement home outside Eugene." "I'm going to see him," Mara said. "Today." She drove east as the sun came up, past fields and shuttered diners, the mist clinging low along the road. The retirement home was quiet, a single-story building tucked behind a nursing facility, and Pruitt was thinner now, slower but sharp-eyed. When she brought up the girls, he didn't pretend to forget. "I remember the one in pink," he said. "Gracie." She looked right at me, then pointed toward the trees. Said, "Who's that man?" I looked, but there was nothing there. Or, I thought there wasn't. Mara leaned forward. "Was there anyone else around?" He shook his head slowly, then paused. "But I remember now. It smelled like smoke, like someone had been camping nearby." 10 years later, the first thread had finally been pulled. Mara spent the rest of the morning retracing Carl Pruitt's memory. Smoke, that single word, shifted the entire shape of the case. In the original search effort, the focus had been squarely on the visible paths, the known trails, the rock ledges around Telescope Hill. No one had seriously considered the idea that someone could have been camping nearby, just out of view, quietly watching. She drove back to the park and met with Shanna, the current ranger, and asked for maps, topographic ones, the older the better. Together they unfurled the paper across the hood of Mara's car. There were faint markings, barely visible now, showing unofficial trails that had once looped into the western side of the forest. One in particular caught Mara's eye. A path that veered off a maintenance access road, curling low behind the telescope platform before disappearing into an area marked as overgrowth. "That one's been blocked off for years," Shanna said. "Storm took most of it out, but it used to lead to an old fire tower." "Still standing?" Mara asked. Shanna shook her head. "Collapsed back in '08, but the concrete base is probably still up there." By noon, Mara was making her way toward the ridge. The trail was half erased by ferns and saplings, but with each step, it grew clearer. Someone had used it recently. The underbrush was parted in places, fresh indentations in the mud showing where boots had pressed down. The farther she went, the more the air changed cooler, damper, the scent of moss, and something else she couldn't name. Something old. She found the remains of the fire tower just after 2. 4 cracked concrete footings formed a square. In the center was a patch of earth too flat, too cleared, as if someone had made camp there again and again. She moved carefully, scanning the ground. Near the base of one footing, half buried beneath pine needles, she found the charred outline of what looked like a burned journal. Most of the pages were gone. But one fragment remained, curled and blackened, and on it a single child's drawing. 2 stick figures, holding hands, standing under stars, and in the corner a third figure, taller, watching from the trees. Mara placed the scorched drawing into an evidence sleeve with gloved hands, careful not to let the brittle edges crumble. It wasn't just the childlike simplicity of the image that unsettled her, it was the clarity of its intent. 2 girls beneath a starry sky, side by side. The telescope unmistakably drawn on the platform nearby, and that third figure, tall, dark, just far enough away to make you wonder if he was coming closer. It wasn't proof, not in any official sense. But it was the first tangible suggestion that the girls had made it off the platform, that they had seen someone, and perhaps that someone had seen them too. She stood slowly and circled the campsite. Nothing else seemed fresh, though there were scattered signs of life. A rusted canteen under a bush, the wire frame of a folding chair long collapsed into the soil. It looked like the place had once been used regularly, then abandoned for years. But there was no way of telling when the last visitor had come. Mara took photos from every angle before making her way back down the path, the light shifting overhead as clouds drifted in. Back at the ranger station, she asked Shanna to check permit records just in case anyone had requested access to the fire tower area in recent years, even unofficially. Shanna shook her head but promised to dig. Mara sat on the porch steps outside and opened her notebook. There were too many puzzle pieces forming a shape she wasn't ready to name. The telescope's new angle, the scrape marks, the reflection. And now this drawing, possibly done by a child in hiding or captivity, left behind in a place only someone familiar with the park's older paths would know. She couldn't help but wonder if this figure, this man, had watched them for days before they vanished, or worse, had been waiting. As she stared into the woods, a strange thought took hold. What if the girls had tried to leave a trail? Not in obvious clues, but in glimmers, in reflections, in whispers left behind for someone to eventually find. And maybe, after 10 long years, someone finally had. The sun dipped low as Mara sat in her car outside the motel, the charred drawing resting on the passenger seat beside her. She hadn't planned to stop by Eric Marlowe's house yet. He had retreated from public life after the media storm died down, avoiding interviews, fundraisers, even vigils. Rumors swirled for years about what he might have known, but none of it stuck. He had never moved away from Maple Rock, though, never remarried, never changed his number. She dialed it just after 7. The line rang twice before his voice came through. Slower than she remembered, rougher around the edges. "Eric, it's Detective Sloan." A pause. She waited. "I figured you'd never come back," he said finally. "What changed? I need to show you something." He didn't ask what, just gave her the address and told her to come by. The house was a modest single story tucked behind a grove of maples, the paint beginning to peel, the yard overgrown but not abandoned. He met her at the door without ceremony and led her into the kitchen, where the table was bare except for an old photo of Lena and Gracie propped against a salt shaker. Mara laid the drawing down beside it. Eric didn't touch it. He only stared. His eyes traced the lines slowly, and for a long time he said nothing. Then, "That's Gracie's. You're sure?" He nodded. She always drew stars like that, 6 points instead of 5. Lena teased her about it. Mara sat down. "I found it at a campsite behind the old fire tower, near Telescope Hill." Eric swallowed hard. "They searched everywhere back then. Almost everywhere. Not there. Not that deep." His fingers hovered near the edge of the paper, but he still didn't touch it. "Do you think she left it, recently?" "I don't know. But I think they were there. Maybe taken there. Maybe kept there." He looked at her then, the first time their eyes met in years. His voice cracked when he spoke. "I knew they didn't just vanish. I knew someone was watching that night." He finally picked up the drawing, his hand trembling. "I just never thought we'd see them again." Eric poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table with the quiet care of a man who had spent years doing everything slowly. Mara didn't touch hers. She kept her eyes on him, watching the way his fingers rested lightly on the rim of the cup, how he never let go of the drawing. He was somewhere between grief and hope, suspended in that strange limbo where memories start to breathe again. "There's something I never told anyone," he said finally. Mara leaned forward. "Go on. The night they disappeared, I told you I stepped away to take a phone call." "That's true. But it wasn't just a call. I was angry. I stepped away because I was frustrated. Gracie kept interrupting Lena while she was trying to read the constellations, and I snapped at them. Told them to give me 5 minutes alone." He looked down into the cup. "I walked down the trail, Not far, maybe 30 yards. I just needed air. But when I turned back, I saw movement. In the trees, not on the platform. Just something shifting. I thought it was an animal. Didn't think twice. Did you ever see a person? He shook his head. No. But after they were gone, I remembered something. The fire. I smelled it too. Like old smoke. Not fresh, not strong. Just enough to know someone had been out there. Mara sat back, her mind connecting points. Why didn't you tell us? I was the last one to see them, he said, voice barely audible. Anything I said would have made me look guilty. She didn't argue. She just let the silence settle. Then Eric reached into a drawer and pulled out an old Polaroid, faded but still visible. Lena and Gracie sitting on the platform, the telescope behind them, stars just starting to rise in the sky. He handed it to her. I took this that night, right before I stepped away. Mara studied the photo. Behind the girls, in the distant blur of trees, something caught her eye. A pale blur between the trunks, not shaped like a branch, not part of the forest. A face, maybe, watching them, and no one had noticed until now. Mara left Eric's house with the Polaroid tucked carefully in a file sleeve, her fingers tingling with the weight of what she'd seen. It wasn't a sharp image, not enough to make out features or identity, but the shape was undeniable. Humanoid, upright, half obscured by trees, but clearly there, and clearly watching. She didn't say goodbye. Not really. Eric stood on the porch with one hand resting on the doorframe, his eyes vacant in a way that made her wonder if he'd always known, deep down, that someone had been out there that night. He had just never wanted to look directly at it. Back at the ranger station, Mara enlarged the image on her laptop, adjusting contrast until the figure stood out more starkly against the tree line. It wasn't her imagination, the way the head was tilted, the shoulders, the suggestion of arms. It was someone, possibly standing still for that photo, possibly watching them long before Eric stepped away. Shanna hovered behind her, arms crossed. That gives me chills, she said quietly. Has anyone ever lived out near the fire tower? Mara asked. Shanna thought for a moment. There used to be a groundskeeper who stayed in a cabin off the Western Trail back in the 90s. Maintenance guy, retired before I started. I could look up records. Mara nodded. Do that. And check supply deliveries, anyone who might have been ordering gear out here without permits. She printed the enhanced image and pinned it beside the scorched drawing in her case folder. It was beginning to build a timeline, a geography. The girls vanished on Telescope Hill. Something or someone had likely been watching. A drawing, found years later, suggested they had at least made it to another location, possibly the fire tower camp, possibly beyond. But the real question hung like mist in her mind. Why had no one heard them? 2 girls, 10 years. Not a single cry, not a note slipped into a ranger's hand, not a trace of escape, unless they hadn't been able to run, unless they were being kept. Mara sat down, staring again at the faint face in the trees. She was no longer chasing a mystery. She was chasing someone. The cabin sat half swallowed by vines, its roof sagging inward, the door hanging crooked from one rusted hinge. Mara stood at the edge of the clearing with Shanna, the two of them silent as birds rustled in the canopy above. It had taken Shanna hours to track down the exact location from Dusty Park records. The groundskeeper listed only by last name, D. Grover. Employed seasonally from 1992 to 2004. No disciplinary issues, no criminal history on file. But his name had never surfaced in the investigation. According to the notes, he stopped showing up the year the tower collapsed, Shanna said. Never came back. No forwarding address. Mara stepped forward, her boots crunching over the brittle ground. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and age. She pushed the door open slowly. It groaned, like something waking up. Inside, the cabin was empty of furniture, but not of signs. A wire clothesline still ran across one corner of the ceiling. There were nails in the wall where pictures had once hung, a shelf with a rusted lantern and 2 cracked enamel cups. But what caught Mara's attention was in the far corner a heavy trapdoor built into the floorboards, sealed with an old padlock, now rusted shut. "Help me with this," she said. Together they pried it open with a crowbar Shanna fetched from her truck. The wood split with a crack, and the lock gave way. Mara lifted the hatch slowly. A wooden ladder descended into darkness. They lowered a flashlight first. The beam caught the edge of what looked like a cot, then a second, and a third. The small cellar was dry, lined with old shelves, a few scattered tin cans, a child's shoe, long faded and caked with dust. Mara stared at it for a long time. Then she descended the ladder one step at a time. Below, the air was colder. Not the kind of cold that came from temperature, but from memory, from absence, from secrets that had sat buried far too long. The shoe was pink, worn, a scuff mark along the side that matched the ones Eric had once described on Gracie's sneakers. Mara knelt beside it, heart pounding. They hadn't vanished. They had been hidden. Mara sat on the edge of the lowest cot, the flashlight casting long shadows on the cellar walls. Dust swirled in the beam like something living, unsettled by her presence. The space wasn't large, maybe 10 feet by 12, but every inch told a quiet, terrible story. The beds were small, child-sized, with thin mattresses that had long since rotted at the corners. On one shelf sat a metal tin of crayons, some still intact, a crumpled paper cup, and tucked into the gap between two planks she found a folded piece of cloth. It was soft flannel, pale blue, patterned with tiny stars. She held it in her hands, fingers numb. They had lived here, at least for a while. That much was certain now. She called it in. Forensics would need to be thorough, methodical. She left the cellar and stood outside, her face tilted toward the sky, breathing in the heavy scent of pine and mildew. Shanna stood nearby, arms folded, her expression unreadable. "They were here," Mara said quietly. Shanna just nodded. "No one should have been living out here. That structure wasn't even on our recent maps." Back at the ranger station, Mara sat alone with the evidence. The shoe, the cloth, the drawing, the photo with the figure in the trees. And now the cellar proof of habitation, of confinement, and, most damning, of planning. This hadn't been impulsive. Whoever took the girls had prepared a space, hidden it from sight, and kept it secret for what could have been days, weeks, maybe longer. But why had they never been seen leaving? She dug back into the park records, now hyper-focused on Grover. His file was thin, no emergency contacts, no listed relatives. Just a driver's license number and a rural mailing address that was no longer active. She submitted a request to the county for archived tax and employment documents. If he was still alive, she'd find him. If not, she'd find out where he was buried. As the hours wore on, Mara thought again of the telescope, of how someone had moved it, deliberately, precisely, to face the woods. Someone had wanted to be seen. Or maybe, someone had wanted to send a message. After all these years, maybe one of the girls had found a way to reach out. And someone, finally, had listened. The forensic team arrived just after sunrise, their boots crunching across the clearing as dew clung to the low brush. Mara stood to the side, arms folded, as they moved into the cabin with quiet precision. Cameras flashed from the cellar below, the sound muted by the weight of what had been uncovered. Every item, every crayon stub, every tin can, every scrap of cloth was treated with reverence, as if it could still whisper something about the girl's time there. A tech emerged holding a faded book, its pages warped but intact. A children's almanac of constellations. Inside, names had been written in smudged pencil. Gracie, Lena. Mara's throat tightened. They had survived for some time, long enough to read, to write, to mark their names on paper and try to hold on to something familiar. She left the forensics team to their work and drove into town, stopping at the county records office. The clerk was hesitant at first, but after a flash of her badge and a signed request, Mara was led to the back archives rows of metal cabinets and yellowed files. She searched for Grover. First name, Daniel. Employed for 12 years as a seasonal groundskeeper, lived alone, no spouse, no next of kin. But there was a note. In 2007, Daniel Grover had applied to foster a child. The request had been denied, flagged due to unsuitable living conditions and remote residence location. Mara stared at the form, the rejection stamped in red across the top. He had tried to go through official channels, and when that failed, had he taken matters into his own hands. Outside, the wind picked up, tossing leaves across the courthouse steps as she stood beneath the overhang. This wasn't just a case of abduction anymore. It was something stranger. Grover had watched the girls, waited for the right moment. Had he believed he was saving them, or was that just how he justified it? Mara didn't have those answers. Not yet. But she knew one thing with certainty. This wasn't over. There was more hidden in those woods, more waiting to be found. And whoever had been watching back then might still be watching now. The following morning brought a soft fog over the valley, the kind that dulled the edges of everything. Mara stood once again at the telescope platform, this time alone. The wood beneath her boots was still damp with dew. She turned the telescope slowly, back toward the angle Avery had discovered it at, aimed not at the stars, but toward the dense tree line just west of the collapsed fire tower. It was the same patch of woods where the reflection had first appeared. She peered through the lens, nothing but mist and trees. But then again, that was the way this case had always worked. The truth rarely arrived as a scream. It whispered. She opened her notebook and flipped to the photograph Eric had given her the girls on the platform, the blurry figure just behind them. She stared at the print for several minutes, then back through the telescope again. Something didn't sit right. The alignment, the timeline, the angle. A thought struck her. She called Avery. By late afternoon, the young student had arrived with her laptop and a small drone. The two women worked side by side, calculating coordinates and elevations. Mara explained her theory. If the telescope had been angled not to look out but down, perhaps the reflection Avery had seen wasn't someone behind her. Maybe it had been someone below. That ridge over there, Mara pointed. It curves around and drops beneath this platform. There could have been a line of sight, something shiny, maybe glass, or water, a mirror. Avery launched the drone and guided it down below the platform, weaving it through trees and brush. The screen showed only flashes of movement at first, but then something glinted. There, Avery said, freezing the frame. The camera hovered just above the remnants of a glass window cracked, partially buried, but still catching light. It looked like part of a trapdoor cover, long detached from its hinges. A hidden entrance. Mara's pulse picked up. If the telescope had been moved to catch that reflection, then someone had wanted it to be found. Not just the cellar, but the path out. And maybe, just maybe, one of the girls had turned the telescope herself. Mara didn't wait. As soon as Avery landed the drone and marked the coordinates, she was already moving through the trees, flashlight bouncing in her hand. The light was starting to fade, that quiet stretch before twilight where color seemed to drain from the forest, leaving everything pale and hushed. Avery kept close behind her, silent now, the excitement in her earlier tone replaced by something more reverent. They both felt it. Something was here. They reached the glinting shape in the underbrush, a rectangle of shattered glass resting at an angle, half covered by moss and broken branches. Mara crouched and brushed away debris, revealing a wooden frame beneath it. Her fingers found a rusted metal latch, barely holding. She lifted. The door creaked open slowly, protesting with every inch. A dark, narrow shaft descended into the earth. This one wasn't like the cabin's cellar. The air that rose from it was colder, untouched, and carried the faint metallic tang of old water and dust. She lowered her flashlight and saw the first rung of a ladder leading down. "I'm going," she said. Avery didn't argue. She only handed over a walkie and said she'd keep watch. Mara descended carefully, 1 foot at a time. The air was heavier down here, more silent than the woods above. When her boots touched the concrete floor, she turned, sweeping her light across the space. It was small, almost bunker-like, but intact, and it had been used. There was a mattress in the corner, cleaner than the ones above, a bucket, a pile of books stacked neatly against the wall. But what caught Mara's breath was the small table pushed up under the only opening, a round vent or skylight, right above the platform slope. Sitting on that table was a mirror, cracked in one corner, but still functional, angled perfectly toward where the telescope would sit. A reflection. Not random, not luck. Someone down here had used the mirror to send a message. And written in marker across the inside wall, still visible beneath years of dust, were 3 words, "I see you." Mara backed up slowly, heart thudding. This wasn't just a prison. It had been a signal tower, and someone had been waiting to be found. Mara climbed back into the fading light, the weight of the discovery clinging to her more heavily than the damp air. Avery stood just beyond the trees, hands stuffed into the pockets of her windbreaker, her eyes wide with a silent question. Mara nodded once, slowly. "It's a secondary hideout," she said. "Someone lived down there for a while, maybe after the cabin, maybe instead of it." They sat on a nearby log as Mara detailed what she'd found: the mattress, the books, the mirror positioned toward the telescope, and the words on the wall. Avery spoke carefully. "So, one of them was trying to get someone's attention?" Mara nodded. "Not just that. They were trying to guide someone to this exact spot. What if that someone was you?" Mara blinked at her. The thought hadn't occurred to her quite that way, but now it lodged itself into place like a gear in a long-stuck clock. They hadn't just been waiting to be seen. They had been aiming for her, or someone like her, someone who wouldn't look away. She stood and looked out over the forest. The trees were nothing but silhouettes now, the last light barely holding on above the ridge. Somewhere out there was the person who had orchestrated all of this. The man in the woods, the figure in the photo, the one who had taken 2 girls on a summer night and built a hidden world to keep them in. But there was more. The state crime lab had called while she was underground. The partial prints pulled from the trapdoor's interior matched someone in the system: Daniel Grover's nephew, Russell Grover. Last known address 2 counties over. No criminal history, but had been listed as a park volunteer briefly in 2014. The year before the girls disappeared. He'd never been flagged. Until now. Mara felt something sharpen inside her. A line being drawn. This wasn't just a theory anymore. The walls of the story were starting to close in. One of the girls had survived long enough to try and guide someone here. That meant there was still a chance. And that chance might be hiding in plain sight. Russell Grover's name wasn't on any recent employment records, no local addresses, no utility bills, nothing that pointed to a stable location. But buried in a 2013 volunteer log was a scanned copy of his ID. Mara printed it out, stared at his face for a long time. He looked young in the photo, maybe early 20s, shaggy hair, faint trace of a mustache, a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. He'd volunteered at the park for just 6 months before disappearing off the records entirely. But the system didn't forget everything. A background check showed a purchase made under his name in 2017, a generator, paid for in cash but registered through a manufacturer's warranty card. The delivery address was a supply depot near the edge of the forest, meant for remote construction crews. And just beyond that, a string of hunting cabins leased out by a private landowner, none of them currently occupied. Mara drove out at dawn. The roads narrowed quickly, the landscape folding into steep ridges and hollows choked with pine. She parked at the trailhead and hiked the last half-mile in. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed in on your skin, made you hyper-aware of every twig snap beneath your boots. She found the cabin tucked into a rock shelf, almost invisible from the trail. A metal stovepipe curled out from the roof, smoke faint in the early light. Someone was home. Mara drew her weapon but kept it low, knocking once on the frame. The door creaked open a few inches, and behind it stood a man with shaggy hair now streaked with gray. His eyes landed on her badge. Then her face. "You're here for the girls," he said. His voice was low, "Steady. I was," she replied, "until I found where they'd been kept." His eyes flicked toward the forest behind her, then back. There was something hollow in him, not fear, not anger, just a kind of resignation, as if he'd known this day would come. "I didn't hurt them," he said. "Not the way people think." "Then, tell me what really happened," she said, and he stepped back, leaving the door open behind him. The air inside the cabin was stale, thick with the scent of old firewood and unwashed fabric. Russell moved slowly, not in fear, but with the heavy gait of a man who had lived too long in shadows. Mara stayed near the door, her hand never straying far from her sidearm, eyes scanning the interior. It was barebones cot, shelves, a propane stove, but it was lived in. Books stacked neatly on the floor, a battered backpack hanging from a hook. He sat on the edge of the cot and rubbed his palms together before speaking. "I never planned any of it," he began. "But I knew what my uncle was doing, not at first. But later, when he got paranoid, when he started talking about how the girls were better off here, away from people who didn't understand them." Mara kept her voice even. "He took them, and you helped him." Russell shook his head. "No, I didn't know until months after. He never brought them near the cabin while I was around. He kept them out at the cellar, but I found the drawings, the toys, heard the voices late at night when I was doing gear checks. That's when I knew." "Why didn't you go to the police?" His eyes were red-rimmed, tired. "I was 23, on probation for something stupid. He said if I told anyone, I'd go down too, and I believed him. So I ran. Quit the park job, disappeared. Tried to pretend I'd imagined it, but I couldn't." He stood, walked to a cabinet, and opened a small box. Inside was a stack of photos, snapshots of the area, old trail markers, and at the bottom, a picture of Lena and Gracie. Not from the telescope platform, from inside the cellar. "They were alive for months," he whispered. "He fed them, read to them, told them their parents didn't want them anymore. And they started to believe him, especially the younger one." Mara felt her breath catch. "Which one?" "Gracie." She looked at him hard. "What happened to them, Russell?" He didn't answer right away. His hand trembled slightly as he put the photo back. "I think one of them escaped," he said, "but I don't think she got far." Mara sat across from Russell at the ranger substation, a mug of untouched coffee growing cold between them. His hands were cuffed but relaxed, folded on the table like he'd been waiting years to have someone finally listen. The air in the room was still, no clock ticking, no voices in the hallway, just the hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the weight of what was being laid bare. "She was older, smarter," Russell said quietly. "Lena. She didn't trust him. She used to sneak up near the trapdoor and stare through the cracks when he was asleep. That's how she figured out the mirror. That telescope was her idea." Mara nodded slowly. "And the drawings? She left them behind on purpose. She used to whisper to Gracie, 'Someone will find us. Someone's looking.' But Gracie," she stopped believing it. He looked down, then continued. "Then one night, the girls were just gone. He woke up screaming. The trapdoor was open, a trail of breadcrumbs, like they were trying to leave signs. We searched for 2 days. He found Lena's jacket snagged on a fence post. He told me she must have fallen, said Gracie came back willingly." Mara's breath caught. "You saw her? After?" Russell hesitated. "Only once. Maybe a year later. I'd been gone, living upstate. Came back one night to check on the old man, and Gracie was there. She looked older, thinner. But she stayed quiet, eyes like glass. He didn't chain her, didn't lock her up anymore. He didn't have to." "What happened to him?" Mara asked. "He died 2 winters ago. I came back after the storm. Found him in the cabin. She was gone." Mara leaned forward. "Gone where?" Russell shook his head. "I don't know. There was no sign, no tracks. Just a blanket folded at the foot of the cot, like she left on her own terms." Silence fell again. If Lena had died trying to escape, and Gracie had been returned, only to vanish again after Grover's death, then there was still a chance. A quiet chance that one sister had survived, and might still be somewhere in those woods, watching. The sun was rising when Mara returned to the woods. Mist clung to the undergrowth like memory, thick and cool as she moved past the fire tower ruins and toward the hidden cellar. Forensics had completed their sweep, but she wasn't there to gather evidence. Not anymore. She was there to listen. Inside the cellar, the air was still. The mirror on the table was now covered with a forensic cloth, the light no longer reflecting through the vent. But everything else remained as it had been. The books, the writing on the wall, the sense of someone trying desperately to leave a trail. Mara crouched and ran her fingers over the faint marks etched into the stone floor. They were shallow but deliberate. Not words, not drawings, just tallies, rows of them carved in groups of 5. Weeks maybe, months. A way to track time when time no longer moved in any real way. She walked the perimeter of the bunker slowly, stopping at the corner where a stack of paper had been recovered. Most of it was blank. But near the bottom, folded nearly to the point of tearing, was a single sheet with handwriting so light it was nearly invisible. "I am not alone." Mara pressed the paper flat and stared at the sentence. It wasn't fearfully written. It wasn't a plea. It read more like a declaration, a promise to self. Or maybe a message to whoever might one day step into that cold room and finally understand what had been endured here. Back outside, she stood at the edge of the platform where the telescope once stood. She looked out across the tree line where the glint had first caught Avery's eye. Birds stirred overhead. The forest felt vast again, the way it always had before people disappeared into it. But now, she wondered, was Gracie still watching? Had she made it to safety and chosen to remain hidden? Or had she become something else, something woven into the fabric of these woods, no longer waiting to be found, but watching those who came too close? Mara didn't know. But she did know this. The woods were not empty. And someone out there had once turned a mirror toward the sky, hoping someone would look back. Autumn arrived quietly, folding over the mountains in gold and rust. The leaves fell like soft echoes, covering the trails and hiding the scars of old footpaths. At the edge of the park, near the base of the old telescope platform, a new sign had been posted. A memorial placard etched with the names Lena and Gracie Wilcox. Beneath their names was a line Mara had insisted on adding. They watched the stars, and someone watched back. It had been 6 weeks since Russell Grover's quiet confession. Charges had been filed, though the case was fragile. Most of what Mara had was circumstantial, wrapped in time and silence. But it was enough to reopen the file fully. Enough to give the Wilcox family something they hadn't had in a decade. Acknowledgement that their daughters had not simply vanished. They had been hidden. Russell remained in custody, cooperative, but guarded. He didn't know where Gracie had gone, or maybe he did and refused to say. Mara had returned to the cabin twice since then, and each time she felt it, the quiet, the weight, the unfinished breath of the woods holding something just out of reach. Shanna had the old platform restored, not just as a tribute, but as a reminder. They set up the telescope again, cleaned and angled it toward the tree line, not at the stars, at the reflection, at the place where a signal had once been sent. And then one morning, just before sunrise, Avery called. She had gone to the platform out of habit, something comforting in the stillness before her classes. She looked through the telescope casually, like always. But this time, there was movement. A shimmer of glass catching light in the trees. Not from the cellar, not from the bunker, from higher up, from the ridge. When Mara arrived hours later, the light was gone, but the feeling remained. Not fear, not finality. Something else. Hope. Someone was still out there, watching, surviving, and maybe one day they would choose to step back into the world. Until then, the telescope would remain, not aimed at the stars but toward the truth, waiting for the light to return.